too much noise today. I just need the road, the rain, and the hum of the engine.
Have you ever felt like there's a part of you don't really understand? Like, you're not sure who you really are anymore? I've been there too. Let me share something with you. Maybe it'll help you see things a little clearer. I used to believe life peaked in our 20s. That after that, things just slowly started winding down. More responsibility, less freedom, the spark fading little by little. That's what everyone around me seemed to say. There's this underlying message in the culture we're all breathing in. Youth is the golden age, and aging is a slow decline. Even if no one says it directly, it's there, in the wrinkle creams, in the glorification of making it by 30, in the quiet panic people carry as birthdays pile up. But something shifted in me, not all at once, but slowly, like dawn creeping into a dark room. I started to see that maybe, just maybe, everything I was told about aging wasn't entirely true. Or rather, it was incomplete. Carl Jung once said, life really begins at 40. Until then, you're just doing research. That hit me like a wave. It wasn't just a comforting quote. It felt like a mirror. And I realized I'd been living like the real story of my life was already written, and now I was just editing the margins. But what if it was the opposite? What if all that came before was just a prologue? There's something radical about imagining that the second half of life is actually the better half. Not in terms of youth or energy, but in depth, clarity, and meaning. It's not how we're taught to think, though. We're surrounded by images of decline, by fear-mongering around aging. Midlife is painted like a crisis, full of broken dreams and impulsive decisions. People leaving marriages, quitting jobs, spiraling into regret. And yeah, I've seen that too. I've felt the edges of that kind of chaos. But underneath it, there's often something else, a quiet hunger for truth. It's not always a breakdown. Sometimes it's a breakthrough. I remember when it started for me. I was around 39, and something felt off. Not dramatically, just a dull ache. I had everything I thought I needed: job, home, relationship, some accomplishments under my belt. From the outside, things looked steady. But inside, it was like my soul was whispering, this isn't it. Not in a dramatic way, but in that persistent, nagging tone you can't quite ignore. I couldn't name it back then. I just felt tired, not physically but emotionally. Worn out from playing roles, from chasing goals that had lost their shine. I would wake up and feel a kind of numbness I didn't want to admit, even to myself. It wasn't depression exactly. It was something subtler, like my life had turned into a checklist. And I was going through the motions with no real sense of why. And the worst part? I felt guilty for feeling that way, because I had so much to be grateful for. And I was grateful. But gratitude doesn't cancel out the longing for something more real, something that feels like you. I started paying attention to that quiet voice inside, the one I used to ignore or drown out with busyness. It asked simple but piercing questions. Who are you living for? What would happen if you stopped pretending? What have you abandoned in yourself just to be accepted? Those questions scared me, but they also felt honest. More honest than most of what I've been telling myself. And slowly, I started to realize that maybe the ache I was feeling wasn't a sign of failure. Maybe it was the beginning of waking up. You see, we're trained to fear middle age, to see it as a slow fade into irrelevance. But what if it's the beginning of finally coming home to yourself? Of peeling off the layers you build up just to survive, just to belong, just to be good enough? I used to think that getting older meant becoming less. But now I'm starting to see that it might mean becoming more real, more grounded, more you. Not the version you built for the world, but the one that's been quietly waiting underneath all along. It's not always easy. God, no. It takes courage to look at your life and admit that some of it was built on fear or the need to prove something. It takes guts to say, I don't want to live like this anymore, even when this is what others call success. But I think that's where real freedom starts. not in achieving more, but in shedding what no longer fits. If you're somewhere near this phase in your life, if you feel that dull ache, that quiet discontent, I want you to know you're not broken. You're just starting to listen. And that's brave. That's the beginning of something real. I used to think life was about getting ahead. Now, I think it's about getting honest. And if that means life begins at 40, then maybe the best is yet to come. There's this strange clarity that starts to emerge when you hit a certain age. It's not the kind that arrives with fanfare or revelation. It creeps in quietly, like morning light through closed blinds. Suddenly, you find yourself looking back and realizing how much of your life was lived in reaction to expectations, to roles you didn't choose, to ideas of success you inherited without question. When I look back at my 20s and 30s, it feels like I was running towards something, away from something, maybe both. I thought I was building a life, but really I was building a version of myself that I thought the world would approve of. There's a lot of striving, a lot of pressure to figure it all out. And with every job title, every relationship, every accomplishment, I hoped it would finally click into place, that feeling of wholeness, of arrival. But it never quite did. I used to think that meant I was doing something wrong, that maybe I hadn't worked hard enough, or loved hard enough, or dreamed big enough. But now I think the problem wasn't what I was doing, it was why I was doing it. So much of my energy was spent chasing things that didn't come from my own center. I didn't know that then. I was just following the map everyone seemed to be using. Get the degree, build the career, settle down, keep climbing. And sure, some of it brought real joy. But much of it felt hollow in ways I couldn't admit to myself at the time. Because what do you do when you've checked all the boxes and still feel lost? I started to understand that those years, those first 40, weren't wasted. They were necessary. They were the foundation. Like scaffolding. I needed them to try, to fail, to feel the limits of what the world told me would make me whole. I needed to taste the emptiness of living someone else's script before I could even begin to write my own. And it's strange, once you see that, you can almost forgive yourself for the detours, the mistakes, the relationships that drained you, the jobs you stayed in too long, the dreams you abandoned. All of it becomes part of the research, as Jung said, necessary messiness, data collected from living. There's something tender about that realization. I remember sitting in my car one evening. It had been a long, exhausting day, nothing special, and suddenly I just started crying. Not because something terrible had happened, but because I finally saw it all for what it was. My life, my story. Not perfect, not glamorous, but mine. And even the parts one was ashamed of had led me here, to this strange, quiet threshold. I don't know if you've ever felt that. Like your whole life was a kind of rehearsal, and only now are you stepping onto the real stage. But there's a bittersweet beauty in it, because you realize you can't change the past, but you can choose what comes next. And that choice, that freedom, is something you can only earn by walking through everything that came before. I think we underestimate how much wisdom is hidden in our own story. We look for answers in books, in experts, in the latest trend. But sometimes the answers are in the mistakes we made, in the things we lost, in the roles we outgrew, in the questions we asked over and over again, never quite getting an answer. Those questions matter. Who am I, really? What kind of life do I want to live? Not to impress anyone, but to feel alive. What would it look like to stop pretending and start showing up as myself, raw and unfiltered? Those are the questions that start to stir when the fog lifts. And yeah, it's scary, because the truth is, once you start asking them, there's no going back. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you now feel. But there's also a strange kind of relief in that. A kind of peace that comes not from having the answers, but from finally being honest enough to ask the questions. So if you're standing at that edge, if the roles you played are starting to feel like costumes, if the goals you once clung to now feel distant or meaningless, I want you to know that this isn't the end of something. It's the beginning of you finding your own voice, of you learning to trust your own rhythm, of you stepping out of the fog and into your own light. And no matter how long it took to get here, you're right on time. There's a strange kind of honesty that starts creeping in when you stop pretending that everything makes sense. I don't mean giving up or falling apart. I mean the kind of honesty that comes from realizing you've been navigating through life half asleep. Like you were following a map that someone else drew, only to realize the terrain it promised never quite matched what you were actually walking through. For most of my early life, I kept thinking there was some magical moment just ahead. The right job, the right relationship, the right level of achievement that would finally make it all feel complete. And every time I reached one of those milestones, there'd be a moment of satisfaction, sure, but also this gnawing feeling like, wait, is this it? It's a weird thing to admit, because on the surface, nothing was wrong. But deep down, I felt disconnected, like I was living next to my life instead of inside it. I kept trying to outrun that fog, pushing forward, busying myself, staying distracted. But that fog, it wasn't out there. It was inside me. It wasn't depression, at least not in the textbook sense. It was more like spiritual vertigo. That feeling you get when all the old answers stop working and the new ones haven't shown up yet. When you realize that most of the stories you've told yourself about who you are, what you need, what matters, were never really yours to begin with. They were passed down, inherited, absorbed like background noise. And yet, even then, even in the thick of that not knowing, I could feel something beginning to shift. Not in a dramatic, thunderclap kind of way. More like a quiet question waking up inside me. What if I stopped trying to fix the fog and just sat in it for a while? That's when things began to change. Sitting in the fog meant facing parts of myself I had spent years avoiding. The doubts I covered with ambition. The loneliness I masked with people-pleasing. The shame I numbed with productivity. I started to see how much of my identity was constructed around being who others needed me to be. And that's a heavy costume to wear for decades. But in that stillness, in the quiet of those questions, I started hearing something softer, something more real. A voice I hadn't listened to in a long time. Not the loud, demanding inner critic. Not the perfectionist. But the part of me that simply asked, what would it feel like to be honest? To stop striving for a moment and just be? I won't pretend it was easy. Sitting in uncertainty never is. There were days I felt like I was unraveling. Days when I wanted to crawl back into the comfort of old habits and familiar masks. But each time I chose to stay present, to not escape, I felt a little less afraid. I realized the fog wasn't trying to hurt me. It was inviting me to stop and finally look inward. There's something powerful about no longer needing to have all the answers. About saying, I don't know who I am right now, but I'm willing to find out. That willingness, that surrender, is where healing begins. It's where the real journey starts. And the beautiful, paradoxical thing is that the more I accepted not knowing, the more clarity began to emerge. Slowly, quietly, like the shapes of trees appearing through early morning mist. I began to feel moments of stillness that weren't empty, but full. Moments where I wasn't achieving or proving, just existing. And that somehow felt revolutionary. It made me think, maybe the point of life isn't to build a perfect version of yourself. Maybe it's to come home to the person you already are underneath it all. Maybe the fog was never a sign of failure, but a sacred space. The in-between where the old self dissolves and the new one hasn't yet taken shape. If you're in that space right now, if life feels unclear, unmoored, if you're asking questions that scare you, I want you to know you're not alone. And more importantly, you're not lost. You're in the sacred fog, the place where true transformation begins. Stay there. Don't rush it. Don't try to force the light. Let the fog soften you. Let strip away what no longer belongs. Let show you, gently, what's been waiting underneath all along. That's not weakness. That's awakening. It's strange how clarity often begins with discomfort, not with some grand realization, but with a quiet sense that what once mattered doesn't anymore. That's how it started for me. The things I used to chase with such intensity, recognition, progress, approval, they began to lose their shine. Not because I stopped caring altogether, but because they no longer filled the space they used to. I started noticing how much of my life had been built around things I thought I was supposed to want. You know the kind: success, stability, validation. And to be fair, those things aren't bad, but they're not the whole picture. They're scaffolding. and eventually you outgrow them. There came a point, and I can't tell you the exact day, but I remember the feeling when I looked around and realized I was still living by rules that no longer applied to me. I had outgrown the life I'd worked so hard to build, and that was terrifying, because then the question became, if I didn't want the things I used to want, what did I want now? It was a hard question to sit with, especially when you've spent so much time convincing yourself that you've finally made it. But when the inner world starts to shift, the outer one often begins to crack. That's not failure. It's an invitation. I began peeling back the layers, asking myself whose dreams I was chasing. Were they mine? Or did they belong to someone else? My parents, my culture, the expectations of my younger self? Somewhere in there, I realized I had built a version of me that was functional, admired even, but not truly alive. It was like living in a beautifully decorated house that didn't feel like home. And so began what I can only describe as the revaluation, the great turning inward. I started measuring things differently. Success wasn't about titles or productivity anymore. It became about alignment, about how something made me feel. Did it bring peace? Did it resonate? Did it allow me to stay honest with myself? That shift was subtle at first. I didn't quit my job or leave everything behind, but I did start saying no more often. I stopped performing. I listened to what drained me. I paid attention to the quiet tugs of intuition I used to ignore. I gave myself permission to not know what came next. And that alone, that permission was revolutionary. There's a point in life when you stop trying to meet the world's expectations and start asking what you expect of yourself. What kind of life feels meaningful? What kind of relationships feel nourishing? What kind of person do you want to be? Not to please others, but to respect your own soul. And it's in that space that you start to redefine what matters. You realize that not everything that once felt urgent is actually important. That some of the people you tried so hard to impress were never your people to begin with. That some of the dreams you gripped onto were placeholders for wounds that hadn't yet healed. This process, this inner reordering, doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds slowly. Sometimes it feels like loss, like letting go of identities that once kept you safe, like mourning the years you spent trying to become someone you were never meant to be. But it's also liberating, because in shedding what no longer fits, you make space for what finally does. And maybe the most profound realization of all is this: your worth was never tied to any of it. Not the achievements, not the performance, not the image. You were worthy all along. Even when you were lost, even when you were pretending, even when you were afraid to ask for more. When I stopped chasing what I was told to value and started asking what actually matters to me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a kind of deep, quiet relief. Like my soul could finally breathe. This stage of life, the one we're taught to fear, is in truth a gift, because it forces you to choose, not blindly, not by default, but consciously. You start to live not from obligation, but from intention. And once you taste that, there's no going back. You know what's wild? Somewhere along the way, I started feeling lighter. Not because life got easier. In some ways, it got more complicated. But I stopped carrying things that weren't mine. Expectations, roles, unspoken rules. One by one, I just started putting them down. It didn't happen with some dramatic gesture. No grand, cinematic scene. It was quieter than that. I just got tired. Tired of editing myself. Tired of smiling when I wanted to cry. Tired of saying yes when everything in me was screaming no. I used to think growing up meant becoming more responsible, more composed, more impressive. But now I think real growth is about becoming more honest. And part of that honesty is admitting that you've spent a lot of your life trying to be who you thought people wanted you to be, even when it didn't feel like you. And it's not like we do that maliciously. We're taught from an early age to fit in, to be agreeable, to follow the script. We learn how to survive. But at some point, survival isn't enough anymore. You start to crave authenticity. And authenticity demands that you stop performing. For me, that began with small rebellions. Saying no without justifying it. Leaving conversations that drained me. Wearing what felt good, not what looked right. Being quiet when I didn't want to speak, and speaking up when I knew it would make things uncomfortable. And with each tiny act of alignment, something incredible happened. I began to feel more real. Less like a character, more like a person. Less polished, maybe, but more grounded. It's scary, though, because being yourself, truly, means risking rejection. It means some people will leave. Some won't understand. You'll be told you've changed, and they'll be right. But what they might not see is that it's not a loss. It's a return, a homecoming. I remember standing in front of the mirror one morning, no makeup, messy hair, still in pajamas, and I looked at myself and thought I like her. Not because she looked put together, but because she looked real. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed to hide. That was a big moment for me. Not glamorous, not earth-shattering, but powerful, because it meant I was finally choosing me. Not the curated version, not the one shaped to please or to perform. Just me, raw, flawed, human. And somehow, that felt more than enough. The world tells us we need to be more productive, more attractive, more successful. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be less. Less filtered, less agreeable, less consumed with what others think. And in that less, you find more space to breathe, to be, to feel. And honestly, the more I leaned into that, the more I started attracting people who saw me, really saw me. Not the version I crafted, but the one I try to hide. The one who cried during sad commercials, who talks to herself while cooking, who gets deeply quiet when something hurts. These are the people I hold on to now. The ones who don't flinch when I'm messy. The ones who don't need me to be on. Because when you're no longer trying to impress anyone, the ones who stay are the ones who matter. There's a deep kind of peace that comes from showing up as you are. No script, no argument, just truth. And that peace is worth everything you'll lose along the way. If you're in that place where you're starting to question who you've been and whether it aligns with who you are, I want to tell you something. You're not broken. You're breaking free. And yeah, it might be uncomfortable at first, but keep going. It gets lighter. It gets quieter. It gets real. And once you feel that, once you start living from that place, you'll wonder how you ever lived any other way. There's a moment, and you'll know it when it comes, when you stop asking, what should I do? And start asking, who am I really? And that shift changes everything. It's subtle, like a change in the wind, but it redirects the entire course of your life. That's what began happening for me. I started hearing a different question in my head. Not how do I fix this, or what do they want from me, but simply what feels true. And it wasn't always easy to answer. Truth can be slippery at first, especially when you've been living by other people's definitions for so long. But I kept coming back to it. And somewhere along the way, I realized that all the things I'd been chasing, the roles, the praise, the polished image, they had very little to do with who I actually was. They were like scaffolding I'd built around the real me. Useful at one time, maybe even necessary. But now, it was time to let them go. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not perfect, not ideal, just whole. And wholeness, I've learned, isn't about getting rid of your flaws. It's about embracing them, integrating them. No longer pretending that your pain doesn't exist or that your fears disqualify you from living fully. There was a time when I thought self-acceptance meant resignation. Like, well, I guess this is just who I am now. But I've come to understand that it's the opposite. Real acceptance is the foundation for change. Because when you stop hiding from yourself, you finally have the power to make choices that align with who you actually are, not the version of you the world tried to shape. It's hard work. Shadow work, they call it. Facing the parts of yourself you were taught to suppress. Your anger, your jealousy, your insecurities. But it's also some of the most healing work you can do. Because those parts, they're not your enemies. They're your teachers. They hold the keys to your wholeness. I started writing letters to the younger versions of me. The one who tried so hard to be good. The one who stayed silent to keep the peace. The one who believed love had to be earned. I told her she didn't have to try so hard. That she was already enough. That it was safe to stop pretending. And something beautiful happened in those moments. I felt myself soften. Not collapse, not give up, just soften. Like I didn't have to brace myself for life anymore. Like I could meet the world from a place of grounded truth instead of anxious striving. There's a kind of wisdom that only comes from doing the inner work. It's not loud or flashy. It's not about having all the answers. It's a quiet knowing, a sense of, I may not have everything figured out, but I trust myself enough to keep going. That trust, it changes everything. And once you begin to live from that place, from wholeness instead of lack, you start making different choices. You stop tolerating what drains you. You stop pretending to be okay when you're not. You start honoring your boundaries, your needs, your desires, not with guilt, but with clarity. That's what this stage of life has been teaching me, that there is immense strength in softness, that healing isn't linear, but every step toward truth matters. That being whole doesn't mean being fixed. It means being fully you, messy, evolving, beautiful in ways that don't need permission. So if you're on this path, if you're starting to look inward instead of outward for answers, I just want to say, keep going. You're not behind. You're not too late. In fact, you're exactly where you need to be. Because real life, the one that feels like yours, begins not when everything is in place, but when you begin to live in alignment with your deepest truth. And from there, everything else starts to make sense. I don't know exactly when it clicked for me. That life wasn't ending, it was beginning. Maybe it was in the middle of an ordinary day, standing in my kitchen with the sun spilling across the counter. Or maybe it was during one of those long, silent walks where I could finally hear myself think. But one day I just knew I didn't have to keep living by default. I could choose differently. There's a quiet kind of joy that comes with that realization. Not the loud, ecstatic kind, but the deep, grounded joy that comes from finally trusting yourself. From realizing that this, right here, right now, is where your real life starts. Not at 20, when you were trying to prove yourself. Not at 30, when you were building something to show the world. But now, at 40 or beyond, when you're building something that feels like home within you. I started paying attention to things I used to overlook. The way my body feels when something aligns. The way my breath changes when I'm forcing versus flowing. The people who energize me without trying. The moments of peace that arrive when I stop resisting what is. It sounds simple, but it took a lifetime to learn how to listen to those signals. And here's the thing. Once you begin living from that place of honesty, everything shifts. It's not that life suddenly becomes easy or perfect. It's that you're finally living on your own terms. You start creating rather than performing, connecting rather than impressing, existing rather than escaping. And in that space, something sacred opens up, a deeper sense of meaning. It's not about chasing happiness anymore. It's about living truthfully, even when it's hard. About loving without needing to control. About giving without betraying yourself. About letting go, not out of defeat, but out of trust in something wiser than fear. That, to me, is the real beginning. When you realize that the life you've been waiting for doesn't arrive with fanfare, it grows slowly from the inside out. It shows up in the way you speak to yourself when no one's listening. In the way you forgive your past, not to forget it, but to be free from it. In the way you stop needing to explain your choices, because they feel right in your bones. Sometimes I think of all the versions of me I've been, the eager achiever, the quiet people pleaser, the anxious overthinker, and I feel nothing but gratitude. Not because they were easy to be, but because they carried me here. Every mistake, every detour, every heartbreak, all of it was the path. All of it was necessary. That's the paradox of awakening. It doesn't mean you leave your old self behind. It means you bring them with you, integrated, accepted, whole. You don't become someone else. You return to who you were before the world told you who to be. And what a beautiful return it is. So if you're reading this and wondering if it's too late, it's not. If you're asking yourself whether you're allowed to start over, you are. And if you're feeling a little scared, a little unsteady, that's okay. That just means you're on the edge of something real. Because life doesn't begin when everything is figured out. It begins when you're brave enough to show up as you are, imperfect, evolving, alive. It begins when you choose truth over comfort, growth over safety, love over fear. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Jung meant when he said life begins at 40. Not because something magical happens overnight, but because Finally, we stop trying to become someone else and start becoming ourselves. That's where the Real story begins. If this felt meaningful to you, it might mean something to someone else too. So hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe. That's how YouTube knows to share it with others. Maybe together, we can help someone see things a little differently.